Is it good? All right. Hey, everyone. I see a few people in the chat. Thanks for joining. Fredrik and I, we're going to talk about OS7. If you have questions, put them in the chat, and we'll try to answer what we can. But since obviously it all starts with Fredrik, I'm going to let you kind of take the lead, and then I'll pull up the alpha thread as kind of a background for us to start. Let's get that up. Okay, oops, wrong screen. Getting used to this. It's been a little while. That's what I want right there. So this will be our alpha thread. And it's really hard to see. Let me zoom it in. It helps. I want to zoom. And it won't zoom. Okay, it won't zoom. I'll have to read it to everybody. All right, so Fredrik did kick off alpha testing in the Crucible. And actually, Fredrik had a pretty good disclaimer. I'll let you take that lead, and then we can kind of start talking through these features.
Sure. So, I mean, we did start alpha testing. So I don't know if everybody knows what alpha testing means, but it means that we're sort of done and doing all the coding, and now we're trying to make sure that everything that we did works. And then we need help with that. So people can come and help us run stuff and test stuff and then tell us that, hey, it worked. But it's expected to be some problems. So like, that doesn't mean that ProffieOS7 is ready to use for everybody. It just means it's on the way and we can use some help with testing. And if you want to help, that's great. If you don't feel like you have the technical knowledge to sort of say, oh, what just happened? What I don't know what to do, but then don't do it, because problems are expected at this stage.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. So we do know that there's obviously people who are more proficient and more used to it, and those would be, I mean, where anybody's welcome to test, but yeah, there's could be issues when you load it up. There could be things that don't work as expected. There could be other things to consider. There's also how it gets uploaded. So if you're brand new and you're not overly proficient, you may want to wait till beta testing or full release. But obviously, anybody who does want to help, come on over to the alpha thread. I do see some people in the chat. Hey, Noam. Hey, Henry. So Noam just has a quick question, so I'll show that real quick, and then we'll jump into these features. So welcome to Proffie. So ProffieOS7, it just the operating system that runs on your Proffie board. The current version is 6.8. You could have older versions running. OS7 is just the newest release that has a lot of new features, which we're about to talk about. But if you're brand new to Proffie, obviously learn about just Proffie as a whole, and then the OS is just the operating system. So that's the software that makes things happen.
Yeah, we have 10 years worth of features in ProffieOS already. So there's a lot of depth to go into if you want to know everything. But we're just going to talk about the new stuff. So
yeah. Yep. So let me switch to our, even though people want to see us, I'm going to try to make this screen bigger. I don't know why my browser wouldn't let me zoom. So I will try to read this for everybody, and we'll just kind of touch on some of the stuff and then kind of show a few examples. And then if there's questions popping in, I do see more people joining us in the chat if I don't get to say hi. The new features, and there's a long list of them, and this thread is linked in the description for this video. So if you're watching now, or if you want to come back and watch later, the links are in the description to the Crucible for this thread. The first post has everything in it, but I'll kind of list a few, and then we can touch on a few of them. So the new code for reading and writing INI files, Fredrik updated that. Primarily, that was for fixing corruption, right?
Yeah, so I was investigating a while back. Some people had problems where their sabers would randomly just sort of say font not found and SD card not found. And I found that a majority of these problems were due to SD card corruptions. And that was caused by increased use of saving files on sabers. Like people were writing new props, and these props, well, you in particular, but these props
it was my fault. It was mostly me.
Because they use save files a lot and they save a lot of stuff on the SD card, If you interrupted it and cut the power at the wrong time, you would have a faulty directory entry in your on your SD card, and it would be a problem. And so the new code gets around all this by just not ever creating new files. It just rewrites the old files over and over again. And if there is a problem during writing, it always has two files and it's swapping between them. It's like it writes in the first one and then writes in the second one and then writes in the first one again. And it keeps track of which one is the latest one all the time. And if something goes wrong in the middle, it knows next time, and it knows that, oh, this is all crap. I'm just going to read the other one. And it should always work, hopefully. So.
And that's where alpha testing comes in. So far, for all the testing I've done, because that was introduced a while ago, pre-alpha, from my point of view, it's been running on everything I've tested, but we obviously need other users.
Yeah, I don't think we need more testers for that particular feature. That's been fairly well tested, because I mean, you can't use ProffieOS without it. So like, it's going to get tested. So
yeah. Cool. And the Teensy 4 support you added, I'm not actually well versed in Teensy, because I joined when you released your very first Proffie board during that original run, so I wasn't in the Teensy world.
Well, the original Teensy, I mean, I had these thing called Teensy Sabers, which are a little add-on board for the Teensy Arduino little processor thing, and since then, that was for the Teensy 3 boards, and since then there's this new family processor called the Teensy 4s, which are amazingly fast. I don't have a Teensy Saber kind of add-on board for these, but I really do like the Teensy processors, and they're super fast. So I've made sure that we're still compatible with those processors. If you want to build a Saber with a Teensy 4, you can, but you then need to add a whole bunch of external components like an amplifier and a FETs for controlling blades, and maybe a battery booster, and all of these things that are normally on a Proffie board all by itself. Oh, and a motion controller. You need like something like that. You need all of these things on an external board to make a complete Saber. But if you went ahead and did that, then you could actually run ProffieOS on it, because we have proper Teensy 4 support now. So
cool. Yeah, and I'm just looking at our view. I'm going to put us back up on screen just because you're describing stuff, and you're like me. You speak with your hands sometimes. So
sure.
I think we're here. I know you. For everybody who's in the chat, hello. I know it's hard to see the screen for whatever reason. My Chrome is acting up and it won't let me zoom in. So we're just going to talk through this stuff. All this stuff is linked. So I know already. I just shrunk that box even more. So don't bother squinting. But we're just kind of talking through these features, and then we're going to demo some stuff and hopefully get to some questions. So the alternate sound files, and no sloppy, I saw Brian's in here, has kind of tested that, but that's a big feature, and I was going to show something about that, but if you want to give kind of a high level, and then I'll get my files ready to kind of just explain it with a little more detail. Hopefully I can zoom in.
Yeah, and there's really two levels to this, because there's two things here, that are two features that are sort of based on the same concept. And because there's the alternate sound files and there's the subdirectories, and they're both sort of based around the idea that if you have the same number of files in two different directories, then it's really easy for ProffieOS to swap between them and say, okay, now I'm going to use these files, but then I'm going to use these files. And as long as there's the same number of files in those two directories, it doesn't have to rescan anything. It just works, right? So it's very important that both of these features, they require the directories that you're swapping between to have the same number of files in them. Otherwise, ProffieOS will get confused and it won't work. But then, so I'm going to start with the subdirectories, which is, there's this, like within ProffieOS, we've sort of, like in general, when you play a sound, most of the time it's just like, I'm going to pick a random one out of these 5 files that you have on this SD card, right? And then we started introducing features that lets you pick which one you want to play. So now you, either from the prop Or in some cases from the style, you can actually select which of these 5 files you actually want to play, which is really nice because it means that you can have like different strengths of files, for instance, or different kinds of effects in these 5 files, and you can select which one you want to play. But then the randomness is gone. Now you don't have any randomness, and it sounds the same every time if you're not careful, right? And so these subdirectories are meant to bring the random back. You can have 5 directories, and each one have a number of files in them. And then you can say, I want to play a sound from directory number 4, and then it will pick one of those and play it. So you can have both selection and randomness.
Yeah, and I'm pulling this up on the screen just to try to show. So this is one of the setups, and I'm going to actually, hopefully, it's still tiny. I don't know. I'm going to try to make it so people can see. But so this is what you're talking about. So what I've done, this is one of the test setups. Now, quotes in particular, with my prop, I've actually changed how they work from OS 6 to OS 7, which we'll get more in depth. But doing this, so I have quotes. So we have a fold. This is one font. It has a folder for quote. Within the quote folder, I've made 3 groups of sounds on this particular font. And then within this, now I have 4 sounds, obviously 0 through 3. What I did on this font is I've actually set these up to be 3 different characters. So the top level folder 000 is one character, 001 is another character, and 002 is the third character. And then there's random quotes for those characters represented here. So then within the style, we're able to set it up so that you can actually pick which of the characters you want to get a randomized quote from. So this is the setup. So if we start at the quote folder, we've got these, the 3 digits 001, 00001, 002, these being 3 different characters. And then within them, we have the same number, so that you'll see there's 4 files here. There's going to be 4 files here. And as Fredrik noted, there has to be the same number of files for this to work. But these are all just different characters. They're just named this way, and they're used with quote. Now, we can do that with all different effects, but the quote one for testing is where I used it.
So I should point out that, like if you just use like the saber prop or something that doesn't care about which effect is actually played, it's going to play one of these 3s, and it's going to pick a font. It's going to pick out of all of these 12 files. It's just going to pick one randomly. This only really makes sense if your prop or your style is doing something where it's selecting which sound to play, right?
Yes.
And so the default way that quotes are played in ProffieOS wouldn't make sense for this setup. It only works if you have a prop that is doing something special with it.
Yeah, and that comes into play, and that'll be obviously further explanation when I get into my prop, which may actually be a whole nother video thinking it through. But what we do is I kind of took this, and I know it's not the same, and I know you worked on MyCom, but I took it as being able to kind of make like a mini MyCom into your Saber through the styles, and that's the other part of what we're doing now with the sounds being able to be set up from the styles. Is you can have different presets do very different things. So, and I know there are people out there who don't like quotes and they're not even interested in this. This is just an example. You don't have to use
quotes. Work on any effect. So, like
any effect can do this. So you could do it with your any sound basically you could have. And the alt actually covers it even further, where we go beyond.
It's actually particularly useful with clashes because we have a feature that lets you pick which clash sound to play. For swings. We have a feature that lets you pick which swings to play depending on the strength of the swing.
Yeah.
And if you're not careful with that, it will sound exactly the same every time you swing because you tend to swing kind of the same way every time. But then if you use the folder directory, then you can have random swings picked by strength. So
yes. Yeah, and the real clash, as I call it in my prop, does the same. It actually picks your clashes and lockups based on how hard you hit. So it would apply there as well. But the other part of it was moving the sounds into the styles, which we kind of glaze over, but that's a big piece of what OS 7 does, is it's going to let each preset kind of have its own thing. So what I was starting to say is if you kind of like quotes, but it's not your main thing, but you wanted to set up a preset that does quotes, you can set up one preset that runs quotes through the style code, but then you can dedicate what would be those controls in a different preset to do something totally different. So instead of the prop, for at least for my prop, in OS 6, the quotes were built in and they actually shared a button with the force effect. Some people liked it, some people didn't. There's going to be a way to undo that in OS 7. And what I've done for my prop is I'm actually migrating quotes out of the prop for users who want. Everything's optional on OS 7. But the quotes will actually migrate back out of the prop and they'll become style controlled, where you just set it up in the style. If you want to use quotes, you can just use quotes randomly by themselves. You can use quotes. You can actually use it so that it has a sequential list of quotes. So it will always play them in a specific sequential order. Or you can set them up in this manner with the randomization and the selection. So it's kind of like you could do random, you could do selected, you could do sequential, and now you can do random but selected.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most fundamental changes in OS 7 is probably it's not it's a little further down on our list here,
Yeah.
but it is the ability for a style to trigger an event, and so
Mhm.
within ProffieOS, we tend to sort of think of you have button presses, and they are usually mapped to events, and these events then play a sound and show something. And so we have events like a clash, for instance, is a typical, very simple, typical event. And it plays a sound and it shows something on the blade. But we've added actually like 50 new events, some of which are a lot more subtle than a simple clash. And we've also made it so that props can trigger events that then blades don't normally do anything with, but like you can then add code in your style that reacts to these events, and then they can emit other events, and then you have the ability to sort of map from one thing to another in your blade with some logic that defines how you actually do it. Like you can do it conditionally, or you can have counters or whatever you want to make it, like you were saying, like count up or count down between, like, or do it randomly. And this ability, the general ability for a style to actually trigger events, can be used for a lot of stuff, because it means that now your style, instead of just being able to show things, it can actually trigger sounds and trigger logic and trigger things in the operating system to do things, right? And this comes back to the alternate sound directory, because that's actually triggered by the style generally. So the other way of doing this, where we were talking about these subdirectories, is the alt directories. And the alt directories are, it's kind of similar, because you have to have a bunch of directories with different files in them, and you have to have the same number of files. But it's a one number that you can select a different alternative. And I kind of think of it as like, let's say you wanted to have a preset that you can switch between like good and evil, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you can have one alternative that is the good one and one that's the evil one, and then you map a control that lets you switch the alt between them. And this, when you do that, not only does it let you switch the color of your blade, but it also lets you switch whatever sounds you want to use those use different sounds, right? So like you can have it switch from when you switch to evil, it can be a much deeper sound and different quotes and whatever you want to, because you can switch all of it all in one go with alt sounds, right? And generally, in most cases, the alternate sounds is a very generic feature. You can use it in many different ways, but most of the time, the blade style is what's in control of how the alt sounds are selected. And so it's triggered by the same thing that we were using. Like when we can trigger an event, one of those events is one that lets you select which alt sounds to use. So
Exactly. Yeah. And I have a bunch of videos. I've done demos and stuff on them. But so just to show everybody visually, and again, I saw the comments about trying the control button in the Zoom. It's because of how Chrome is displaying through StreamYard. It's just interrupt. It's not letting me. So thank you for the recommendation. I am looking at the chat. We're just talking through stuff, but I will try to get back to it. But it's not letting me zoom. But so the way the alts work is it can be any sound, group of sounds, or anything you want. So this is again a single font. And this font was set up for the demo I did with the last Airbender font, where I had a fire blade, a water blade, an earth blade, and air. And all I did was I set up alts. Now, any sound you want in the font, and I'm sorry for the small print. I'll try to get screenshots of this added somewhere where it's easier to see. But so like my lightning block, my melt, my tracks, color change. Those sounds I all left. So those are in the main root directory of the font. Everything else is in an alt. And again, you have to have the same number of files. But so my actually begin drag, lockup, drag, blast, clash, hum, which is important, in, out, and then the swing files, those are inside an alt. And the alts are numbered 000, 001, 002, etc. And they have the same number of files. But now what happens is when we switch alt directories through the style, particularly for the style that this runs through, it changes the visual effects, but then it also switches your hum, your swing, your ignitions, and all the other effects, the clashes, the blast, the lockups, to these alternate sounds, all on the fly. So you can, and the way the video was set up, the demo, is I had it mapped different controls to each of the air bending or the bending. So for those not familiar with Avatar, it's essentially you can choose what element you want your blade to represent. So if I wanted fire, I had one control changed it to fire, no matter what it was currently in. One control changed it to water, no matter what it was in. One changed it to earth, and one changed to air. And the idea is typically like we would used to do like color change or color select, and you would always advance one. So you change to the next one and then change to the next one. Because again, we're able to use the styles to control the alt sound as well as the effects. And now with particularly a lot of this will be coming through my prop because my prop has the slots available to let this happen. But you can now set it up so that if you just have a good and a light and a dark blade style, light and dark sound effects, the color change and those old methods are perfectly fine because you're really just every time you go forward one, you're technically just toggling back and forth. It's when we get into like, the 4, as in these ones, where I did have a Cal Kestis set up where I actually had all 8 of his possible blade colors with different hums and stuff. Instead of having to get stuck where you're always jumping one to one, because we can map through the style, you can have different controls go in different directions. You can have different controls go to different things specifically. And then it also changes out those sounds. So now your visual effects and your sound effects are going to stay in sync. And again, how you control them is also you get to pick. So you can have one preset that has, a good and evil, and it just has a single way to toggle them. And then your very next preset can have 4 different blades with 4 different sounds, and you toggle them individually from different button controls. And it's all, again, a single saber, but changing that preset allows you to then change also what happens with the controls.
I should point out that this can be used, like I said before, there's a powerful feature and there's lots of different ways to use it. Probably the easiest one, which I added specific support for, is to use it together with the existing color change, which works in all props. Well, except yours, I guess, because you disabled it.
Yeah, I had to for
the regular color change functionality. If you use it with some regular, like you can use this with a Saber prop. You don't have to use Fernando's prop to do this. It'll work with any prop. The easy way is simply to tie it to the color change property, and that way, when you put a color change thing in your style, and you put a little thing in there that says, okay, I want the alt to change as well, and then now it's just going to change sounds for you when you change color style, and that's really all you need to do if you want to keep it simple.
Yeah,
but there's no limit here. You can also tie in all of these extra controls, and you can make it work like a pinball machine if you want to.
Yes. Yeah, let me pull up our list again. But yeah, and what I was a lot of the development I did was obviously through my prop, but large portions of this can run through other props. The limiting factor would be how you control it essentially. So, and again, I'll probably do a different video on my prop. What I've done in my prop is I've first of all set up a bunch of defines that let you turn off features that might otherwise be controlled by a style. And then secondly is I've added essentially what I call them special abilities. They're basically user slots that waits for the style to tell it what to do. So the style, that's what lets the style kind of talk through the prop. Whereas if you just went with the default saber, you really only have the controls that are there. There's currently no way for the user features to pop through for that prop. Now they could be added, or someone obviously can modify.
You could also do weird things, like you can trigger things by a clash or something. But
yeah,
but what I'm trying to say is, like, so this actually goes very much into our development process. Like, you come up with some idea, and it's usually a little out there, and
a little bit.
They're like, hey, you're like, I'm gonna play games on my saber, and I'm like, okay, that's weird. But the fundamental feature that you need is something that lets you swap sounds, and I'm like, okay, that sounds like a really useful and powerful feature, and I'm going to write it in such a way that you can use it to do all the weird stuff you want to do. But I also try to keep it simple and basic so that it can be either incorporated into other props or used directly as is without having to do anything complicated.
Yes.
And I think that for the alt sounds, I think there's a really good example of this, because like the simple way of using it with just color change, it's really straightforward, doesn't take anything complicated, but you can go so much deeper if you want to.
Yes, and for those keeping track, there is a function that ties this together. And again, I know it's hard to read for anybody running. It's the sync to alt variance F function that's in the list of functions. And it may be a mouthful, but that function is what essentially ties the color change to the alt. Now, you do have to set the alt font up, but then you can just use color change and have that function in place within your style. And that's what Fredrik's talking about. That would work with just any prop that does color change. It would allow for you to also change those sound effects. And it'll let you do other things as well. Again, so I always preface by saying a lot of what I talk about comes from my props point of view. And as Fredrik just said, it doesn't mean that's the only way, but obviously development plus what I've done, I've come obviously from that point of view. But the sync alt to variance F, mouthful, is the function that would allow for that to happen. So for those who are going to test without my prop or on another prop, and you want to match that up to have a color change feature that also changes your alt font, that's the function that you're looking for. And I don't know if we're going to touch on all this, but that's the goal.
No, I don't think we're going to have time for all of it. It's
yeah. So, and let me take a quick break because I'm not ignoring the chat. I'm listening. We're kind of discussing. So hello to everybody, because there's a lot of hellos in here. Let's see. Where are we at? I'm got to catch back up. I'm sorry. The keep sounds for repeating, Cole. Yes, and Brian answered that already. That's why I need to keep up with chat. That's the no repeat random define, which is in your list as well.
It's not new, so I don't think that's in there.
It's not new. Well,
no repeat random has been in there. It's also in OS6, I'm pretty sure.
It was. Oh, you know what? You're right.
It's been updated because it has support for all of these new things, and so like, if you're playing, it actually knows if you're playing a sub sound, but it's a different sub sound from before. It knows, oh, you're not repeating, so I don't have to do anything.
Yes. All right, and let's see. I'll just bring this up because it got asked. The style editor, Fredrik, usually you don't touch that till after beta because of all the changes that are possible, right?
It really depends. I mean, it really depends on how much work I have to do, and that really depends on how many problems we find during alpha testing. If people are happy just jumping in and testing and everything just works, then I'll be writing documentation and updating the style editor as soon as I can. If people find lots of bugs, then I'll be busy fixing those.
Yes. So as we get alpha testing done is when, and Frederick's time allows, is when that would work. Let's catch up with a few more. Brian, we actually started this. I don't know if you were here early, but the subfolders, that's what we kind of started with in the beginning with the earlier in the video where we showed, and I know it's hard to see, the 00, 001, 002, and then the same number of numbered files within. Those are what they're used for is it provides randomization of selected sounds. So if you pick a sound out of some effect by number, you can still randomize what's happening. So we were talking about that earlier. I think you may have missed the very beginning. Let's see. This is a common question, Cole. Yes, older configs always run. They're just missing some of the new stuff, pretty much, right, Frederick?
Yeah, no, there should be. I'm not aware of anything that is not backwards compatible, so everything should still work with an older config file.
Yep. If you alpha test and you find something, let us know.
Yep.
Let's see. Oh, Brian's answering the questions for us, so thanks, Brian. Okay. All right. He's helping us out in the chat. All right. Let's do a few more. We are going to probably. We got probably another 25 minutes. I know both of us have other stuff. Let me catch back up on this. So the clash detection, that was a big one, right? You've updated clash detection because we had a group of users with OS 6 that were having problems that were really hard. I still never replicated it on any of my servers.
I'm still not quite sure. I mean, so in OS 6, one of the big updates there was that it updated the code that reads data from the motion chip to run in an interrupt. And that allowed it to run much faster and much smoother, but it also brought a bunch of problems with clash detection. And it got more sensitive, and there seems to be a lot more false positive, and a lot of people reported problems with it. But I still actually don't really know why. I've looked at that many times, and I'm not quite sure why it was such a problem, because reading it more often should make the code better and maybe a little bit more sensitive, but really the kind of problems that we saw, I don't know where they came from. However, I think it was you who asked me, like, okay, so how do we detect clashes in the prop? And you're like, I've been using the swing acceleration for a while, and that seems to be working well, but maybe we should have a better way. And I'm like, you what? Swing acceleration? What you mean you can find clashes with swing acceleration? And so it turns out that when you look at the swing the way that swings behave on very short time scales, they're very much like acceleration and accelerometer, that they vary wildly when a clash occurs. And it depends a little bit on what type of clash it is, actually, because what's actually happening is that if your saber is vibrating this way or up and down, the accelerometer is going to generate that, have a big swing in it. But if it's rotating like this instead when you have a clash, then the accelerometer, the gyroscope is actually going to have a vibration instead, which is actually bigger than the accelerometer in that case. And so I actually ended up adding both of these two together and checking both and applying a tiny filter to it. And this seems to have made all the problems we had with clash detection basically go away. I still don't understand what the problems were, but with a better algorithm, we seem to be doing much better now. So
Yeah. So every person I've encountered who still had some trouble with OS 6 with clashes, for a long time, I've been telling them to try the pre-alpha, obviously. And all the feedback that I've encountered is it fixed it for everybody I've
been. I don't know for certain that everything everywhere is fixed, but it's certainly a lot better.
Yeah. So if anybody has tested or does test and still encounters, obviously, also let us know. Let's see, we've got a bunch more stuff in here. A few of these I'm going to skip because I think they're going to snowball on us. But bendable time, that was a big one. That's the one that actually came up, and I think it was Brian. And if it wasn't Brian, I apologize for whoever brought the original idea up. But was to have particularly wipes, but transitions speed up or slow down. So instead of being a constant speed, that's what the bendable time is now.
Right. And this has been an ask. This is something that people have been asking for a really long time. I think since before transitions even existed. So this goes back to OS4 sometime, maybe even before that. People really wanted a way to have ignition, like when the blade extends, to sort of start slow and speed up as it goes, or vice versa in some cases.
Yeah.
Um, and well, that's not super hard to implement per se. It's just that doing it in a way that lets you combine it with other things. Like I have an aversion towards implementing 10 different, like taking one style class and then just making 10 different versions of it, because
Which is what I did originally.
because it tends to create such a plethora of things, and it's just really hard to maintain. uh, what we have now is actually much better because it works basically with all transitions, and
Yeah.
it lets you, like, the when you specify how long you want the transition to take, you can actually add this little class to it. And what happens is that the transition doesn't really know, it just gets its clock bent. Like it experiences time on a scale that changes over time. And so it just works, and it just works for all transitions. And this is really great because it means that we can have one way to bend time, and it lets us have, I think maybe we have 10 or 12 different types of transitions, and they all can have bent time now. The old way of doing it would have meant that we would have had, we have 4 ways of bending time, and we have 10 classes that we were going to support. Now we have 40 classes, and
Yeah.
that would have been horrible. So
No, it definitely turned out as a better. Yeah, my original, and this was going back a while, I had TR wipe Excel, TR wipe decel, TR wipe in Excel, TR wipe in decel, and they were doing similar things. But then obviously in discussion, you said, "Hey, why don't we just make it for everything?" And I was like, "Oh, we could do that," and of course we can. So it made it much easier, and it does work. I've tested on pretty much all the transitions, and a few of them you can't quite tell the time is bent,
right,
but
unless
it's not working.
yeah, I mean, if you have it depends on your perception, because like if you just have a fade, for instance, right? um, it might be, in fact, that uh, if you do a fade with a bent time, it actually might look like it's doing it in a more linear way than it would normally do, because our eye's perception of brightness is not linear. So, well, maybe that's what you actually want, because
Yeah.
but it can be hard to tell because your eyes may deceive you.
Yes, and for those who are going to test I'm getting tongue tied. The bent time, longer time is makes it much more visible. So if you are already somebody, if you use like wipe with like 300 milliseconds, no matter how much you bend that time, your eye won't necessarily perceive it. Most of mine I've been doing, almost 1,000 milliseconds to really get the perspective. And if you now, because you can bend it both ways, you can have it accelerate super fast, like 90% of the blade, and then that last little 10%, like those last 3 pixels, are what slow down, and they'll take a really long time. Or you can flip it and have it kind of just start out really small and then launch, and it's still, even though it's taking that long to do the whole thing. Again, perception looks good, but that was one thing at least I noticed in testing. If you have really short transition times, you're not going to necessarily tell that time is being bent.
Right. No, that's it's not gonna register. So
Yeah. Let's see. A few of these are cleanups. So there's a few things to save additional memory. There was the removal of the help command. There's the new disable talkie. I'm kind of jumping around just to cover some
Sure.
small things. Um, disable talkie saves. What did we ended up figuring out? It was like 7,600 bytes.
Something like that. I mean,
Yeah,
I haven't checked the actual number since earlier. So
but for those of you who are wanting to add more and more stuff, we have a few of those.
I had lots of fun with the beep codes, by the way. I don't know if
Yeah.
you noticed.
Oh no, I did. Yeah. So originally, when I put that in, I think I had one beep for one thing, two beeps for another, three for another, and it was too boring. So Fredrik went and created a whole bunch of actual tones, which you have linked. I think they're in Pod, right? Or they're not in Pod
They're
yet.
not in pod yet. I need to make a page for it so that they are properly documented. But yes, I actually composed them in a musical score and made them sound good, and like you can actually sing the error codes to these beeps. And the idea is that like if you can just listen to the beep and then try to sing the error code, you can maybe figure out what it means without even going and looking up the error code. And I mean that's just kind of silly, really. It's not an important feature, but it's kind of fun. So
Yeah, I mean, I originally came after it of just trying. I'm trying to eke out all the memory I can because I love loading a lot of stuff on. So I stumbled into the talkies and I was like, oh, these guys take up a good chunk of space. So if you use disable talkie, the spoken prompts, so your SD card not found, error in font directory, error in blade array, and a few of the other spoken things, which are the computerized voice, not sound library, so not the voice pack sounds. Those are different. These are the ones that just come from the board. Disable Talkie turns those off, replaces them with beep sequences that Fredrik composed to save you some memory. But just be mindful now. If you have an error on your board, it's going to be a composition of sounds instead of telling you what's wrong. So you'll have to go then figure it out from there. Or you could hook to serial monitor because the serial monitor still outputs the same error.
right.
Let's see. Da, da, da. So we've got. There was a bug fix for the mixer. I only caught the tail end of that. That was only with the filter applied, right? Was that where that popped up?
No, the it's actually not. This is an old bug. I don't know especially particularly how old, but it may have been there since the early days of Teensy Saber.
Hmm.
And essentially, what's happening is that if you have a lot of sounds going and they are very loud, you can actually overflow an internal variable in the dynamic mixer, and this would um, in the if you're not using the filters, this would just cause a click or a blip or something. Like it wouldn't cause anything major. Everything would still work, but there would be an unfortunate side effect in what the actual sound. Um, Pretty minor, but it's fixed now. If you were using filters, on the other hand, which use a lot of floating point math, it would try to run a square root on a negative number, which gives you an invalid floating point number. And then it would try to multiply that number with a bunch of other floating point numbers, and then they will all end up becoming invalid floating point numbers. And so the filter would be all the internal variables in the filter would become invalid floating point numbers. And so the sound would just give out and not come back until you turn the saber off. The filters made this a lot more noticeable, but the actual bug has been there forever. So
Oh, okay. Yeah, I caught the tail of that, so I saw that. Oh, no, we got time. I'll cover a few more. So TR Concat. So transitions there's a bunch of new transitions that we've kind of stuck in, and I'll touch on them. But TR Concat was one that you actually just you pulled the color out of them. So for those who aren't familiar, if you had transitions that you wanted to do a bunch of things with, you used to have to always put a color in the space. And for me, even some of my styles, I would just put a clear layer. I would do like a white with an int0 alpha layer, just because it needed a color in there, but I didn't need anything to have happen. So Fredrik's made it so that you can write a concat with several transitions all against each other without that color being needed in between, which opens the door for a lot more stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
the that color always bothered me because a lot of times, um, when in certain situations, you were doing a transition, and the color that you had to insert actually had to match something in your external style for this to actually work properly. And so if you had a blue blade, the color in the transition had to be blue, or it wouldn't work properly. Sometimes you could get away with a transparent one, but that's not always right either. And so being able to do this without a color in it means that you get a slightly different thing. It works differently, but it also lets you do things that you couldn't do before.
yeah, and there's a lot. So the other new transitions, and this is for alpha testing, that we were to go. So the TR Blink. So this one came about. There was a user. It was a little ways back. So the this actually stems from the Luke, the deleted scene, the cave scene in Return of the Jedi with the beeps, the blinking sequences on the little arrows on his saber. I have that in my library, but I use the Boing, which has a little bit of a fade. And on NeoPixel, if you do it quick enough, it's not so noticeable. But one user had just an LED where it was really made it not look right. So Blink is essentially it's essentially the Boing effect, just doesn't have the fade on it. But what that does, it's literal on off. So your color black, or you could put alternate colors in there. But that's what Blink is, for those who haven't seen it. TR Do effect, that's the big boy, at least from my point of view. That's what makes a lot of what we've been talking about tonight happen, and a lot of stuff we didn't get to touch on. But that's the piece of style now that's going to let that style do other things. And it can be used in a lot of different ways that will probably, I'm hoping to have a few more of these live videos to talk through stuff, but also documentation coming out, because this opens so many doors. Because you can, the big one, the start point is the alt sounds, but it essentially is the key to letting styles do things that buttons used to do in the past.
And I mean, at its simplest, like what I would imagine that people will use it the most for is simply to trigger a sound from a style. So
Mm-hmm.
like you can have your style say, okay, uh, I detected something and now I want to play a quote. Boom, just
Yep.
run a quote effect and it plays. And you can select which one you can select which one you want to play if that's what you want, or you can set when you select which one you can say -1 and it picks one randomly.
Yes.
And so I think everything else sort of builds upon that idea that you can trigger a sound or something else. Like it depends on what the effect is, right? But like if you start off as thinking at okay, this is a way to trigger a sound from a style, then you have the idea of what it does. But it could be anything. It could trigger other stuff as well. So
Yeah, and I did have a demo actually. If I can get this to work, I'll kind of show it. Let's see if it's going to let me. But go, yeah, keep going on that. I'm sorry, I'm trying to switch screens on this thing. Where'd you go? I had you. There you are. Let's see if this works. I hope the audio comes through. So I have a bunch of the videos, and I've put them on the Crucible too, but I've got this page. So the transition sounds and sound loop. Okay, you can hear it. So I do a lot of talking. I know people tell me. But this is an application of TR Do effect with the new transition sound. And transition sound is just a generic sound that you can do whatever you want with. The video I'm talking over right now, this has a twist control that brings those two sparks together. When those two sparks visually touch, they trigger a transition that also plays the sound of an explosion. Hopefully it's loud enough. And I think I'm about to do it in a minute. And I'll let that go without my voiceover. Or I'm still talking. Man, I talk a lot, don't I? Where are you? Yeah, I talked for the first 3 minutes of that video. There it is. It's about to happen.
I'm going to get an explosion. And the sound effect and the visual effect are always going to be.
So that's using the TR do effect with that's running transition pulse, which is another new capability. And what it does is when it detects that those two colors come together because of the twist control, it triggers that do effect that then kicks off the transition sound, which in this case is the explosion. And that's how if you could bring those two together and never touch them and no sound, but the second you bring it together, it does two things. It triggers the sound effect of the explosion, but then it also shows the visual of the explosion. And that's all the combination of the TR do effect triggering the sound, but also the TR do effect kicking off that explosion. And then the detection is through the functions that run through transition pulse.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens with all of these new features, because obviously there's a lot of interaction between the styles and the fonts that didn't used to be there. And it's not clear how font makers are going to react to this, and if they're going to start making a bunch of styles, or if there's going to be how people are going to adapt the fonts in order to do these sort of things, right? So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to tell you, I have a very wild imagination. I have thousands of things I've already thought of, but there's so many more. And as more people come in, I mean, these tools. So these are all just pieces that you can put together in so many different ways. I think of it now as, basically you have a Lego store in front of you, and it's your imagination for how you take these pieces and come put together your finished product. But the ability of TR, so long tangent, but TR do effect is going to be the big piece to a lot of this sound effect. I've called them chained effects, where one effect kicks off something else. So like you said, a quote, I've done effects where certain actions will actually can trigger a quote, but then also trigger something else after that. So you can take a bunch of the transitions of TR do effect and put them in a line and have a sound, a quote, a visual effect, another sound, a quote, a visual effect. Like you can put all these in a long chain, and then how it kicks off is also controlled. You can have it kick off just with a normal blast, a normal clash, a normal force effect, or we can, through transition pulse, we can actually make it that interactive stuff where if I point my blade up, do this. If I point my blade down, do that. And it's outside of the prop. It's actually that style has those interactive capabilities in them. Your next preset, you point it up, nothing happens. So you really can customize how everything runs.
And I think this is the sort of the important part here, is that none of this stuff was impossible before. You could do all of this stuff if you just knew how to code. But even if you did that, you wouldn't sort of, it was actually hard to do it so that every preset was different. And it wasn't shareable, right? Like if I coded up a prop that worked differently, I would have to share my prop file with somebody, and it would work exactly the same for them, which is great if that's all what you want. But the new system is way more flexible, because now you have these blobs of code that are styles that you can share, and you can be like, oh, I want to take this style, and I'm just going to put both of them in my prop file or in my config file. And now I have, one thing that, Fernando made up, and one thing that somebody else made up, and I just stick them both in my config file, and I have two different presets that do completely different things. And it didn't actually require any coding. It does require an active imagination to do, but it doesn't actually require coding to do anymore, and it's shareable in a way that it wasn't before. And because you can have it in only some of your presets, not all of them, it means that you can have a Saber that it has both crazy, stupid, silly presets and serious cosplayer presets all in the same thing. So
yep. Yeah, it's obviously, I say a lot, but it's really going to be unlimited. It's only limited by imagination, and it's not even limited by an individual's imagination. It's going to be the community's imagination.
Right.
So we are coming up on our hour. So maybe let me just see. I think there's a lot more to talk about.
Let's see if we have any more questions, maybe.
Yeah, I'm gonna run through that. I got to go backwards again. Yeah, let's see. Brian, yes, Brian did love the Ben time. Let's see. Yeah, this was old fork. The 2.6. That was a long. That feels like a eons ago. Let's see. I think I don't see too many. So I think Sawyer. This was so. I think you're asking if you wanted to match a specific clash sound to a quote. I think you could make that happen because we have wave number, right? So you could actually have it so that wave number in a transition pulse does a TR do effect for quote and then pick the quote. It kind of make it probably is overkill because it might just be easier to put the quote at the end of the class sound in a single wave, but you could do it.
Right.
But you might be really overcomplicating how it happens. But I mean, that's the thing now is the pieces. There's so many pieces that could be reconfigured. I think you could make that happen.
So somebody's asking about documentation here, which I think a great segue to talk about a little bit about the pod.
Yes. Yeah, let me pull that up. I had that up. Give me 1 second. And I know it's gonna be hard to read. I'm sorry.
So I don't know if everybody's aware, but we have a new documentation site for ProffieOS called the Pod, or ProffieOS documentation. And as a part of the alpha process, I haven't started this yet, but like what I really want to do is we have one thread going where we're going to make sure that every new feature is tested. And I'm actually going to start another thread to make sure that every new feature is documented. And every new feature, it will be a sort of a similar thing, and there will be a thread with a list of features, and then for each feature we'll have an entry that points to a URL for documentation. And I invite everybody to help out with that because the pod site is it's not exactly a wiki because, well, it is a wiki, but it's set up so that everybody who makes edits to it, they create pull requests in GitHub that somebody like me has to review, and then they go on the sites. But the idea is that we want to make sure that we do better with documentation than we have in the past. And this is part of the pod is part of that process. But also I want to make sure that all the new stuff that we're adding is well documented somewhere. That doesn't mean that every feature will have a new page on the pod. Some of these links will actually go to source files or to existing documentation, and that's fine. I just want to make sure that there's written documentation and that the link goes to the most natural place to find that documentation. And so, so that's the goal for the new features, is to all have something written down about them somewhere. And clearly, documentation is not ever a finished project. It's you always want to do better. And yeah, if anybody wants to help with writing documentation on the pod, go ahead. It's all open. You just click the little edit button up there, and you can
it's the pencil.
You can add to a page, or you can create new pages. So
yeah, and that's a good. Yeah, I mean I've typically written some documentation on my site where I needed pictures and stuff, but now we can do pictures here. So that typically, particularly my prop, I usually did a separate HTML file, which I'll still do, but I'm gonna put some of that stuff now I can do here because the old wiki I couldn't get pictures, I couldn't get some of the stuff I needed in there. But now with this we can, right? We can put images and stuff.
This is backed by a regular GitHub repository, and the edit button up there is only one way to make edits to this site. You can use all your normal Git tools to check out, check in, create pull requests. It all works the same way. And there's there's really no like with the old wiki, it was really hard to check in images. It had to be done in a very particular and weird way. This doesn't have any of those problems. You just check in an image and link to it and in the file, and that's it. So
Yeah, so this should be a lot better. So as anybody is alpha testing and you're learning, if you're able to also put some documentation together, that will help everybody get ahead of the game. So, and then you and I will fill in the gaps as we're able to. I have a list of things I'm working on to help out, including documentation. I do have some new tools, obviously library stuff, but kind of where possible, anybody else who's able to, test something, figure out how it works, and then put it into written form for others, that would be a good help as well.
I get questions sometimes. People ask me like, "Hey, can I buy you a beer or something?" Like, can I'm really happy what we're doing. Like, what can I do for you? And I always tell people to pay it forward. Help somebody else, write a documentation page, do something that helps the community. I don't need it. Just pay it forward, right? So
yeah.
And so like if you're grateful to me, the way to show it is to help out. So
very well said. All right. Was there anything else you wanted to cover? I didn't want to keep us too much longer.
No, I think we've covered the important stuff. There's a lot more detail in here, but like we don't have all night. So
no, we don't. So I'll probably, and I obviously invite you back. My prop, I feel like I need to dedicate a show to. If you're able to join, if you're going to be bored from it or think my stuff's too crazy, no worries. But I'll probably go through some discussion on that stuff. And then if we can get back together, we can go through more. Otherwise, documentation. I really wanted to get you on, obviously, because of all the work we've done. And without you, none of this comes. But also to try to kick off people who are so inclined and want to help to come into the Crucible, take a look through that alpha thread. It is linked in the description to this video. Read through that. There's a really long list, and I apologize that my screen was so tiny. But read through the list and try stuff out. And that's the other piece I didn't get to say. If you want to test a feature and you don't quite understand how it works or how it's supposed to work, post in that thread asking. And that way, either Fredrik or I can give you the breadcrumbs to get started. In some cases, some of the stuff is self-explanatory, but in other cases, some of the stuff is vague or there's so many uses, it's a little hard. So we can kind of help, at least direct you in the right way to get it.
Right. And those questions are actually really helpful because when we write the answers to those questions, that forms the basis for what eventually becomes documentation. Mm-hmm. And so simply asking those questions is don't feel silly, like just do it because it's actually helpful. So
so we're underway, and I know Brian's done a few tests. I saw a few people come in. Obviously, since I was involved in development, I don't usually chime in on what I've tested, but if we get towards the end and there's stuff that hasn't been, I've kind of tested it all, so I can also chime in, but figure it's probably better to have outside eyes on all this stuff. You usually tell me so.
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of features, I prefer if somebody who didn't sort of design or write the feature tests it. So, like if it's a second person who takes a look at it, that gives you an idea of whether it is an understandable feature that can actually be used by other people. So
yeah. Oh, there's one more question. Because I know this pops up. So any updates on a new board?
I'm just going to say stay tuned. Nothing right now. So
okay, perfect. Well, thanks so much for taking the time tonight, and obviously thanks even more for in coming up with Proffie, and also for taking my crazy ideas and not shoving me out the door with them. So
so yeah, it's still fun, so that's why I'm doing it. So
great. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining. I'll try to do another video if Fredrik's available. I will certainly try to have him on again, and we'll keep running through. But any questions, anything whatsoever, the links are in the description. Go visit the Crucible and take a look at stuff, and then I'll probably post some other links to all the demo videos. So I did a lot of demo videos, but it feels like an eternity ago. Just also to give an inclination of what some of these features are. So it kind of shows you the visual demos of what these new capabilities are. So Thanks so much, Frederick. Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll talk to you guys soon.